Nice to see so many old friends and have so many people walk up to me and say, hey, I listened to Renewable on the show and I wanted to come and meet her. A lot of people did, and in the next session, we'll have a film. We've got about a short 15-minute film where you can see Renata's school, and it's a fantastic place, and you'll see some of the amazing things that she's doing. We'll also be able to go to Rajasthan, and Prakash, who's on this panel, is from Rajasthan, and will show us a project that's similar to his in many ways, that deals with water in a similar way. And this is the natural resources panel, and we've got three folks on the panel who really are tackling the complex world of natural resources and doing it in ways that are hopefully going to make the world a better place here in the end. We're going to hear in a few minutes from Fred Carter, who's with the Black Oak Center for Sustainable Renewable Living and working for a post-carbon world using permaculture, which is an awesome practice I hope you're a little familiar with, and if you're not, Fred will make you more familiar with it in a minute. And Moira Zellner is someone who is an environmentalist originally, and as I understand it, then fell into the world of urban planning, and is an urban planning at UIC, and specializes in complex systems and what to do about, how to make complex systems and come together and work, which is what our future is going to be based on. And lastly, Prakash Tyagi is going to start us off here, and I'm just going to ask him to get us a little familiar with his work and the environment in Rajasthan. When you know Rajasthan, when we were visiting, I thought, oh, it's going to be dry, it's going to be a desert, it's going to be like this. And it was a little different than I expected. There's some vegetation there. It's a more vegetative desert than, say, the Arizona desert. It has bushy things, and there's so many more people. When we drove out to a village it's just people after, village after village after village in this really dry environment, and it's hilly, and that people have these water ponds, and we'll show all that in the film that we'll see later. And Prakash's parents both went to work with the people who were in rural Rajasthan and developed the organization GRAVIS. And him and his wife now run the organization. They're both physicians, have brought a huge healthcare component to it. And we're thrilled to have Prakash Tyagi here today to talk about the environment and water and the very different place that is Rajasthan. Prakash.
Thanks, Jerome, for the kind introduction. It's great to be here, ladies and gentlemen, in this panel. Great honor to be here. Thanks, everyone, for coming. It's been a very hot winter in India, so it's great to be here in some cold weather, some snow. Nothing to complain about. I'll speak about my work, the organization that I represent, but I'll begin by saying a few things about India which may not be new to you, but I have been hearing a bit about India's progress, to start with from Brian and Asha and the other panelists. So India is definitely making a lot of progress. India is definitely in the headlines, making right moves. But India's story and India's situation is unique. India's problems are unique for three reasons. One, we talk about India's diversity. We know about India's diversity. A lot of us are here, are from India. A lot of you may have visited the country. Diversity of religion, of language, South Indian food, North Indian food. But apart from that, India's diversity is also very visible in the status of development. And when we talk about this massive GDP growth and the progress that the country is making, it's not very inclusive, it's not very equitable, and there are many Indias within India which are completely disconnected and deprived of this growth. So I work in one of those areas, to which I will come back a bit later in the talk. But just to make sure that as we look at India as a nation, as a country, we do not forget the realities of those areas which are not really moving forward, which are still stuck in poverty and problems. Secondly, India is a large country, we know that. In just a few years, India will be the largest country on the planet, leaving China behind. That's probably the only thing in which India can surpass China at the moment. But apart from this large population, India's contribution to global problems will definitely be high because it's a large population. But that contribution is actually disproportionate. So if India is 1/6 of the global population, in a lot of problems, India's contribution is more than 1/6, 1/4, 1/3 in some areas. So India continues to have very high indicators of undernutrition, poverty, communicable and non-communicable diseases. So we have those challenges, that those challenges need to be remembered, understood. And thirdly, as some people have mentioned, India is a capable country. India has a lot of internal resources. India has one of the strongest civil society in the world. Very capable organizations, knowledge, expertise within the country, which need to be fully utilized, which will solve India's problems. But please remember that the work being done in India inspires other countries, other communities, particularly in Southeast Asia, but also in the African neighboring continent. So India's growth, India's progress in this context then means progress in programs and progress in the other countries too. I'll be brief in telling about the organization that I work with and the work that we do. So I just said that there are many pockets in India which are extremely underdeveloped. So GRAVIS, the organization that I represent, works in the Thar Desert region of India, Rajasthan state, northwestern part of the country. As Jerome just said, it's a lot of people. It's a desert, but it's a lot of people. Approximately 28 million people live in this desert. That makes this desert the most densely populated desert ecosystem in the world. I see some people from that area here, so it's wonderful to see those people here. So this desert is a very complicated area with chronic droughts, serious problems with food and water insecurities. And please let me know when I should, just a couple of more minutes?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So with all these conditions, serious poverty levels, chronic droughts, water absolutely unavailable with the communities. I have been here for the last couple of days, and this is what we get in the year, the last two days, rain or snow, whatever it is. So it's a very dry area, very arid area, and water being the most basic prerequisite of life, it leaves people with poverty, hunger, undernutrition. So one of the most important parts of our work is to work on rural livelihoods, which is natural resource management, which is drought mitigation, and which is basically working around rainwater, and to make sure that all the rains that come to the area, which is approximately 6 to 8 inches in a year, that rainwater is adequately captured, utilized, not letting a drop go waste is the philosophy that we work with. The area does not have enough groundwater. The levels are as deep as 1,500 feet in the area, so that's impossible. So therefore, all our work is focused on harvesting the rains. Then harvested rainwater is used for drinking water availability within the households, agricultural development, and then allied agricultural activities such as horticulture. So all of this then leads to communities having enough food, enough water, as well as incomes which they gain from their agricultural produce. We, as an organization which is working at the grassroots level, also very strongly believe in our role in the climate change processes. Because as we all know, that this whole climate change discussion which is happening at the global level, the causes are probably globally universal, but the impacts of climate change are probably understood but are not fully known, as well as vary from communities to communities, where you have this blizzard or whatever it is called in the east coast of the US this year, one of the strongest in the history. We just had one of the hottest winters in India. And therefore, the communities, the countries, the people at ground level are the only ones who would know what is going to happen in the context of their own climate, in the context of their own environment. And therefore, we believe that we have an important responsibility in making sure that the climate change discussions are decentralized. People understand in their own ways, people understand the impacts on their own environments, on their own livelihoods. So we are a strong advocate in that. And we believe that the discussions which are happening at global level, something which happened in Paris recently, is absolutely disconnected with the real ground level situations. Very briefly, the second part of our work is about healthcare. We try to provide holistic solutions to communities. Jerome mentioned that we run a large health program. As an organization, we believe that health is a major challenge, a major need. I was very happy to hear from Brian that our health system is doing really well, which may be true in some parts of the country. But India, being such a large country with a population which is booming every day, there are many parts of the country which are completely disconnected from government-provided or privately run medical services. So we run a strong medical program which is coupled with public health interventions and publications and research studies on prominent health issues. Within the health work of GRAVIS that we do, one of our major thrust areas is to focus on health problems that have been ignored or forgotten by other organizations or the government. So one example of that would be, which we have been trying to run as a campaign, is to focus on occupational lung diseases, mainly silicosis, which is a major killer in the area as a big non-communicable disease, and is highly prominent in people working in mines and quarries, where they expose their lungs to this airborne dust, and thousands of people die at premature ages. So GRAVIS as an organization has been running this campaign to make sure that mine workers work in these mines with more protection, with more health safety arrangements. Finally, before I let other panelists speak, what I would like to say is that as a grassroots level organization that GRAVIS is, I believe that many of us have had the privilege of attaining higher education, which is wonderful, but we don't need to think that we always have to invent or always have to bring in some Nobel Prize winning solutions for the communities. The communities have a number of traditional knowledge pieces available within themselves. I think as organizations, we need to be facilitators. As organizations, we need to come forward to bring more ideas, more thoughts, to make sure that this traditional knowledge is consolidated and results into real ground level action. So GRAVIS as an organization has this very deep belief in blending traditional wisdom with modern science. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Prakash, Tyagi. We'll get to more and have some conversation about silicosis and other issues as we move along here. Let's hear from Moira Zellner and hear about complex systems in the environment and natural resources.
Two together. Hello, everyone. Thank you also for inviting me. It's really exciting to be here, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion later. So, yes, I stumbled, fell, really dove into urban planning. It was not where I started. I started out as an ecologist in Argentina. that's where I first came across the idea of complex systems as they apply to how we define ecosystems, like how you have all these different parts, different plants, different animals, water, soil, that come together to form a system that has its own integrity and history and organization. And then I went to work in an environmental engineering consulting firm. And so I had all these ideas of how, I was going to inform the practice with all this knowledge of ecology, and they were like, what? So this was early 90s, again, Argentina, so a very different context. I hope it's different now there. But in any case, the frustration that I felt when, we were really talking in parallel here, there was no integration of knowledge. And I realized I didn't really know much about humans. So, when I talked to my advisor, he said, well, what you want to do is called urban planning. I'm like, oh, really? Well, I didn't know. I thought urban planning was more urban design. And in fact, in Argentina, it kind of is defined more that way. But I was more into resource management. And so that's how I stumbled upon urban planning and how I ended up in the US at the University of Michigan studying planning and complex systems. And there I learned more about the tools and how to model these systems, because I thought, well, really cities are kind of like ecosystems. You have these different parts that come together. There's nothing really directing them to do so. We have government, but the government doesn't really direct us. It can guide us sometimes, but put incentives or disincentives here and there. But what makes a city is not government. It's all this interaction between people, businesses, different kinds of entities, and so on. And so I thought, okay, we can understand cities as in that way and see how they overlay and interact with natural processes, then we can have some ideas of how to improve our environment. And so I'll just give you a couple of examples of the kinds of work that I do. This is a software called NetLogo. It's for free. You can download it if you're ever curious about it. And it has a wonderful library of models. And this is called the traffic basic one. And I think that you can all relate to this one if you drive. So essentially, this is a very simple model that illustrates what a complex system is. You have individual cars here. And the only thing that the cars care about is what is ahead of them. So if there's space, they're going to accelerate until they find, maybe another car, or until they get to a maximum speed. If they find a car ahead of them, they're going to match the speed of that car and then decelerate a little bit, like just step on the brake a little bit. So here's what happens when you have this very, very simple behavior, and the car, there's nothing directing traffic here, okay? So let's see what happens. I'll just let it go a little bit slower. No, you're fine. So there's a traffic jam that emerges. But there's nothing really telling the cars, okay, jam up. Okay? It just happens by virtue of this interaction between the car and whatever is ahead of them. So what do you think can make that traffic jam go away? Let's try a few things. Usually I actually have my students do this, but I'm not going to call on you guys. So I'll just make a few changes. Say that, I brake more abruptly. That doesn't seem to help much. Anybody has an idea? Move what? Move them faster? Yeah, let's let them accelerate more. I don't think so. Okay. Carpooling, yeah.
A stop sign.
So what happened there? Yeah, well, you know what? You don't need another road to make the traffic jam go away. The only thing that I changed here was that I moved this little slider that reduces the deceleration, which means don't drive so abruptly. Don't brake so abruptly. Just match the speed of the car ahead of you, and you won't have a traffic jam.
Are you sure you're helping people, Moira?
Oh, yes, I am. There's another solution to this. That one I don't recommend as much, which is, you can go the other direction and actually accelerate like crazy so that you match up the speed of the car ahead of you more quickly. But that one, I think it's a little bit more dangerous. So I wouldn't go that route. And it actually takes a little bit longer to get there, I think. But the insight from this, so I do this kind of modeling, first of all, just because it relates, I think, to a lot of people. But think of the implications in terms of fuel consumption, pollution, wearing of brakes, and things like that. It actually has real environmental implications, even though this is not the full picture of reality. Okay? Now, I always say this. I was, born and raised in Buenos Aires, and as a driver there, forget, driving school and like whatever they teach you and the good practices of driving. But, this is what we should really do, and I think that's what they teach in driving school, right? So just match the speed of the car ahead of you, and you can really do wonders in terms of traffic flow. So the other kind of example that I wanted to give you is a little bit more, with a little bit more complication, which is exurban development. And here you have different shades of green, and the bright green means that there's a lot of ecological, value in that area. And you have like a new center. As you can see sometimes in the suburbs, new centers, workplaces or shopping malls or whatever that come up. And depending on what people look for, usually they look for both access to these centers, but also being in an area that is green, right? And so you can have different patterns of residential expansion based on what people prefer. If people don't care at all about being close to these, centers, then you have a very different kind of pattern, right? Now, if people still prefer this, and they're not aware, but they're actually degrading the environment when they develop, without changing people's, preferences, you have yet a very different kind of pattern. So what's happening here is you have extreme sprawl, because people are just degrading the environment, and so that's why you get like all this darker green, like the change in the landscape going to darker green, deteriorated landscape. But people are looking for, the ecological quality farther and farther and farther away. And so what I do is use these models to understand how these interactions matter and lead to unintended consequences. Nobody really wants to destroy the planet. I don't really think so, okay? We don't wake up saying like, hey, let's just burn everything down. No. We really just are looking to do the best for us and for everybody, but sometimes we're not aware of these interactions and how they can lead to this global problem. So I use these kinds of models to understand some of these issues and to then inform policy design of like what are the things that we can do. So if we're going to think of zoning or different kinds of policies or economic incentives, how do we put them in here so that they make a different result, so that we end up in a different place, okay? But I've done, for example, work on flooding. And so I created, so here, for example, you can also, I've overlaid this with groundwater flow, so we're talking about groundwater as well. But essentially the concept is the same one. You degrade the environment, and so you end up just expanding the problem farther and farther as long as you have growth going on. But I also worked on other urban flooding models. And so, the idea was to investigate how much green infrastructure, which has been a big topic here in Chicago, how it can help reduce a problem. And, we used the model to come up with different designs at the neighborhood level. So not just at a site, in one lot, how green infrastructure can help reduce runoff in a house, but it's more about the neighborhood. And, do we put the green infrastructure all bunched up here or scattered over here, and what are the constraints? And so we came up with some recommendations, but then we realized, we cannot really come up with the best answer for the community without the community's involvement. Why? Well, because, the solutions that we can come up with that, we think are great might cost millions of dollars. But if you're the community leader or the policymaker in that community and you only have 500,000, well, then I guess that solution doesn't work. If you are, one of the residents who always gets flooded no matter what you do, because, there are areas that, with that level of investment are always going to get flooded, well, you're not going to be happy with anything that, that we come up with. If you're the resident upstream who doesn't realize that actually your runoff is contributing to the flooding downstream, you have a very different perspective, and yet a different perspective is that of the environmentalist who wants to reduce flooding at all costs, no matter what it costs. And so we realized that, first of all, we needed to build some of these models with the community to also incorporate their knowledge, as you were saying as well. But also to include not just their technical knowledge of the problem, but their values and their interests, and give them a platform around which they could have a discussion, informed by the reality and the complexity of the problem, but also informed by the complexity of their values. And so what we've been working on is in creating a set of tools that allow that to happen. So we try to think of the most inexpensive, portable kind of technology that we could think of. And around iPads, paper mats, wooden tokens, and create kind of like a game-like situation there. And so I don't know if you can, the pictures might be a little bit too small. Let me see if I can make, oops, that's too much. Well, okay, more or less, I can guide you through. So there, each different actor or participant in this, in the problem, has an iPad where they can actually select and say, like, what is the most important thing for me? Is it about reducing cost? Is it about reducing flooding? Is it about reducing monetary damages? And so each of them can select that. Then they play on a paper map here, and they put on these wooden tokens that, the paper map is a map of their neighborhood, and they put their wooden tokens that represent different kinds of infrastructure to handle flooding. And so then we have an application that takes a picture of that, uploads it in a simulation on that logo, similar to the kinds of things that I just showed you. It runs it in a couple of minutes, and it gives the results that then each of them have on their iPad, sorted out by what they are interested in. So for example, one scenario might be great for me, the environmentalist, because it really reduces flooding in the area and downstream. Great. But for the policymaker, it was terrible because it meant millions of dollars, and we don't have that kind of money. And so they are sorted out differently. My preferred scenario may not be your preferred scenario. And so it's like, okay, let's come together now, compare what is it that makes it good for me, bad for you. Let's rethink this, both in terms of how we design, where the green infrastructure is, but also my values. Do I have a different understanding of where you are coming from? Do you have a different understanding from where I am coming from? And do we reshuffle our priorities? And so this is what we have been doing in terms of working with communities and trying to bring them together and engage. And what we've seen so far is that in a 2-hour meeting, they really learn much more about how water flows through their landscape. And based on that, they come up with really cool designs, which we hadn't even thought of. And then also discussions like, well, this is great for you, but not for me. Let's see what the trade-offs are and how we compromise around them. So far we're excited.
All right, really interesting. Moira Zellner from UIC, the Department of Urban Planning. And now we're going to swing over to Fred Carter. He is the co-founder of the Black Oak Center for Sustainable Renewable Living, working on a transition to a post-carbon world. Sounds like you've figured out all the trade-offs and are implementing.
Yeah, it's hard to just be in a conversation and not walking. So we can talk and walk, and that's our primary commitment.
Yeah, get that a little closer.
Yeah. So I'm the executive director and president of Black Oak Center. We're a non-for-profit that was started in 2006. I blame my son for everything. One morning in 2003, he woke up and it didn't snow for Christmas, and he started crying, and Dad, what's wrong when there's no snow for Christmas? His mother, who's a doctor, told, why don't you find out why it didn't snow? So when he did the research on why it didn't snow, he said, Dad, you messed up my world. He said, and what are you going to do about it? So, I mean, when your child says something like that to you, what do? At the time, he was 8, and we didn't know what to do. So what we did do was started looking at the impact energy had on our lifestyle. So in the process of doing that, we learned a great deal about peak oil, resource depletion, and all the other things that we talked about here today. And I came from an industry that was so committed to creating that problem. I was a tier 1 for General Motors. And we ran one of the largest distribution centers in the state, the 8th largest. And I was toxing up the world. So I didn't realize that energy was in the background of everything that we're talking about. Soil depletion, water depletion, you name it, energy has some role in that. And also in the industrial development of our lifestyle. We eat energy, energy allows us to move around, everything is involved in energy. So what we created was an organization called Black Oak Center for Sustainable Renewable Living, it's a long name, for a post-carbon world, because we just knew that at some point we wouldn't have all this. And so what would people do? And so we started the journey. I'd say we fell in the rabbit hole kind of early. And we started learning a lot more about the environment in a community that never thought about environment. During that time, we was at Yellow Springs, Ohio, at a peak oil conference. And there was a young lady that asked me, said, why is it that black people are not involved in the environmental movement? Wow, that's a good question. And what I realized, it was the language. So the language is a barrier for people seeing relationship to what it is you're talking about, all right? So we had to come up with another language. We call it, so people can understand what we're saying. What value does climate change have on me when I don't see how it impacts my day-to-day life? First, it used to be like this abstract thing in space. I don't see how it works on 79th Street. So what impact does it have on me on 79th Street? I never thought about whether energy had anything to do with anything. So we created Black Oak Center to train and educate communities and how to address these 4 areas. So we created 4 educational tracks. 1, sustainable energy, which we just talked about, sustainable agriculture, natural building, and also what we call resiliency, which to us is the most important thing. We can talk about everything we want to talk about, technology, design, and all that, but if we don't deal with the internal designer, all we do is create the past, all right? So we started the journey of how we can educate the community that we live in, who are the first line of impact on every area. We consume more energy because we don't have the money to pay for efficient appliances. Our food system is horrible. So what our focus has been on for the last 6 years is in food. I didn't know that it takes 10 to 15 calories of fossil fuel to eat the food that I eat on a day-to-day basis. I mean, it was something I never thought about. And then the community that I'm in eats food that are not life-affirming. So it's a lot of problems by eating that type of food. So we wanted to make sure that we can have an impact publicly, public health-wise, learning about energy as it relates to community, we finally got into learning about what is permaculture. I don't know if you're familiar with the term, but basically it's just an integration of indigenous wisdom and ecological science. And one thing that we found out in the process of sharing with communities, a tremendous amount of wealth that's been misidentified in the areas that we lived in. Everybody was told that we had nothing, so you have nothing, you can't do anything. So the reinterpreting of the environment for us was the beginning of a different type of education. So we had to learn how to reinterpret the environment because there's so much resignation where I live. No possibility, just like the lady was saying earlier. So how do you shift a world of no possibility to a world of possibility? You reinterpret that world. So we started using ecological patterns and language, which was very ancient, even though we think it's not. When you talk about complexity, people have learned to live with complexity for millions of years. It's just something happened in the last couple hundred years. that we got away from what it's like to live with complexity. The core value that we hold is that there's two worlds of interpretation. One interpretation is how I can extract for maximum profit. I used to make a great living doing that, right? We used to design just-in-time systems. Now we got a just-in-time everything, which means that there's no resiliency nowhere left. Specifically in food, there's no resiliency in our food system. So we believe that we have to redefine what life has been. So we got this extracted model, which is the dominant brain way of looking at everything. We even do that with our relationship with each other. How much I can extract out of you determines on how I have a relationship with you. When there's nothing to get, men knows it real well, they move on. So this way of thinking, we feel, is the fundamental problem that our community has, because we look as extracting from outside the community. But when you start looking at it from an indigenous perspective, from ecological model of thinking, you look at the environment that you're in. So looking at the environment that we're in, we created these programs around energy, food. My wife, who's a medical doctor, but she's board certified in alternative medicine, her patients decided first that they couldn't afford whole paycheck, which is whole food. She used food as medicine. So what we created was a food buying club in her medical practice. So the cornerstone of all of what we can talk about, at the end of the day, it's about your health and well-being. That's the core of any design. If it's not being designed with that at the end, it's not an effective design. So we started with food at her medical practice because she has a commitment to public health too. We started with 50 people, 40 people. From that, we bought land out in Pembroke, where we are right now, about 40 acres of land. We started buying food from our neighbors, who were mostly rural farmers, for her medical patients. People started getting well, right? So from there, we figured out, how can we expand on this? How can you get people? And one extraordinary thing about food, it crossed all racial lines. It doesn't matter who you are, what color you are, what your size, height, or where you grow up at, no matter what environment you come from. One core thread that we all share is we like to eat. And eating is a great organizing tool to change people's behavior. Even mothers who are in the community that we are, they even value, people say, well, you don't really value children, but when kids are sick, I don't care who you are, you want a healthy child.
Yeah. I wanted to kind of talk about some of the commonalities here. And, it seems like you and Prakash have a similar thing in that you're really about well-being. You're doing really different things, but you guys are both aiming at well-being of people and communities. And can we talk about water for a second, how we deal with water and how it connects to well-being? I mean, it seems like we have a completely opposite philosophy. Prakash is trying to save every drop of water that falls from the sky. We try to get rid of every drop of water that falls from the sky and shove it down the Mississippi River. Yes. It's kind of crazy. And then we end up with places like Flint that don't have any water because of industrial power nightmares. Yeah. How do you look at that? Does water make you crazy, Prakash?
Yeah.
No, definitely. The water situation in some parts of the world is definitely very concerning, and the Thar Desert is definitely one of those areas. Imagine having 6 to 8 inches of rain in a year, which also comes once in a while, and there could be multiple years of absolutely zero rainfall with absolutely no rains coming to the areas. And to be able to live with that kind of a rain in rural areas where agriculture continues to be the main contributor to rural economy, it's very, very difficult. And then once again, the groundwater level situation has been exploited quite a lot, and the levels are depleting very rapidly in rural communities. So therefore, all that we do is very environment friendly, focusing on rainwater and making sure that every drop of rainwater is collected and used for the community use. And once again, going back to what I said, that it's important to understand local technologies, what is available within the area, the methods that people have evolved themselves, they have used themselves within these drought conditions, these drought areas, and then to bring in more modern science into it, and to respect those technologies, and then try to replicate and scale up that work with which people can raise their agricultural produce, can have more water in their homes for drinking. And then the impact is very, very deep on their lives. It's not only about food and water, but it's also about education for girls. It's about integrated health impacts on women and girls within the families, because there is a lot of water fetching drudgery which women and girls within the households, the nature of the work, the whole gender component coming into it is responsible for that. It was really good to hear different panelists speaking about the educational part in the last panel, and how girls are the ones which are missing in the educational programs in many parts of India and other parts of the world. And once again, drinking water is one of the critical reasons behind that, because these girls have to spend multiple hours every day to bring water to their homes. So we are very confident that yes, it's limited. It's a small amount. Once again, 6 inches would probably be laughable for somebody living in North America or other parts of the world where the rain amounts are very high. But actually, if that is properly captured and utilized, it makes a lot of difference. Otherwise, that rain goes away. That rain just goes away as wastewater. And if properly taken into account, that rain actually makes a lot of difference. So with our work, we are reaching out to more than 1 million people, approximately 60,000 households in the area. And by working on these technologies, we have been able to provide greater food security and water security, leading to higher incomes, more enrollment of girls in primary schools, as well as increased health-seeking behaviors, integrated health impact on rural communities. So we believe that within rainwater there is a lot of possibilities and a lot of solutions.
Moira, do you see people using rainwater differently around here? I mean, it seems like cities and suburbs are trying to change their habits a little bit when it comes to water. And, I've got a rain garden. I'm trying to put a little back into the ground.
Yes, thank you.
But I think our progress seems really slow.
I think that here there are 2 issues. So I do actually a lot of work on water sustainability. So part of it is here in Chicago, of course we have this huge lake right next door, and so our perception is that we've got tons of water. We don't really have to worry about it. But the fact is that because of legal constraints, and even if there is growth, the renewability of the lake is actually quite low. And then all the communities that cannot take water from the lake, but that rely on groundwater, actually, some of them are facing droughts, and the projections are not good, despite the climate change projections that there's going to be more rain. The fact that there's going to be more rain doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be more recharge.
Right.
Okay.
I went to school in DeKalb, and I did a report on where we get the water in DeKalb, and I went to the DeKalb water office, and the guy put his feet up on the desk and says, "Yeah, we're going to run out in like 2050.
Right.
Right. And I was like, what do you mean we're going to run out of water in 2050?
Right.
That is like right around the corner. How can you sit here and not do anything?
Right. And there's a lot of that, because I think that it's overwhelming. And I think that it's better to just kind of like, well, let's push it back another couple of decades, and so we don't have to deal with it right now. Or, well, we're going to go to whatever river. And I'm like, yeah, but what happens to the communities downstream? Okay, we hadn't really thought about that. So, there is that kind of that disconnection between where we are in that system and what happens to the water. I work with a hydrologist from the U.S. Geological Survey, Howard Reeves, and he, told me this, there is no such thing as water surplus. Water is always going somewhere, and if it's not going there, then it's gonna go over there. If we're not drinking it, then it's just gonna, go flood somewhere, or, something like that. But there's no water surplus. It's always going, right? And so there's the issue then of the water supply and our perspective and our preferences and how we see water here in this region. There's lots of it, so we don't really have to worry that much about it. But there are, as you say, there are communities that are increasingly aware of that because of the restrictions, to tap on the lake. And then there's the issue of flooding, which is kind of how can we possibly have drought and flooding in the same region? But we do. And it would be great if we could actually say, okay, let's use that flooding, and reroute it somehow and think of integrated management where it goes to, recharge and provide for water supply. And I think we're kind of far from there yet.
Fred, you have some thoughts on water?
Last summer we sat in 2 feet of water. And there was no place for the water to go. I think it had a lot to do with the agricultural practices out there in the community. It's a rural town, it's an agricultural town. For the first time, the water didn't have a place to go. So we were sitting in 2 feet of water for over 30 days. And it never happened before. And of course, we've had droughts. And when you're in food, water is very critical. And also the pattern that's occurring now is the Midwest could be the next food belt because California doesn't have water. And that's what we're looking at here close because water, without water, there's no food. So we've had a lot of personal journeys around how to conserve water. So we talk about how to conserve water personally first, which is a hard conversation to be in. We're kind of weird for a lot of people where we manage water. We don't even talk about it publicly all the time. My wife is really very rigorous about conserving water in the kitchen, recycling water. We have a gray water system in our site. We got gravity-fed water systems. We're off-grid. So the personal commitment to conserve water was always high on our list. And when you talk about communities out there, we had contaminated water out there where we're at now. So it's a challenge, We got deep water. We've had contamination water from dumping sites that have been dumped. And so water is very, very critical. So it's on a community level, the community does not know what to do with that conversation. So it's like something you put on the side. And it's important, but it's not important unless you got something like Flint.
Yeah.
So we got a slow process of Flint here because we don't have the greatest water, even though we're told we do. But for us, it's a real problem. We don't know how to grow because of what happened last year. We don't know how to plan. Farmers are going out of business because of what happened last year. And the fear of the possibility of it happening again this year, which we think it might. So water, from one extreme to the next, I think is one of the greatest challenges humanity has going forward.
And Prakash, you were telling me last night that the water's not falling when it's supposed to in Rajasthan. That it seems like the water, it's almost like a flooding problem. If it doesn't come when everybody wants it, it throws everything off.
Yeah, so it's not only the lack of rains, but when does it rain makes a lot of difference. So that is exactly what we are seeing in the last few years. And what we are seeing is that, historically, lack of rains have been responsible for lack of crops because there is no rain and then there is no crop. But recently, when the crops are ready to be harvested, here come the rains. And in high velocity, and for the last 2 to 3 years, actually, untimely excessive rains have caused tremendous amount of damage to the crops. So all the hard work of the farmers in preparing these crops, ready to be harvested, and the whole happiness goes away with one very quick rain shower. So this has actually been very significant problem in the last 2 to 3 years. I don't know what is going to be the solution, but this is another climate change impact that we have been seeing. So in other words, the rainfall may be increasing the overall precipitation, but when does it happen makes a lot of difference. So even if it's more than what we get in an annual span, that would probably be doing good to drinking water availability. But when it comes to the crops, it's actually very, very adverse. So,
And what crops do you grow there in Rajasthan? Because you were telling me last night that like vegetables are hard pressed to grow there.
yes, rural Rajasthan or the Thar Desert region is more known for its millet. Millet is the main staple food, which is used for making breads. Wheat is grown too in some areas, but it requires more water. But because it's such a dry area, it has very limited choices, limited options. Rice is unthinkable. People just don't eat rice because it's impossible to cultivate with the kind of rainfalls. But then the other problem is the nutritional part with the dietary diversity in the forms of vegetables and fruits, and therefore the malnutrition and micronutrient deficiency levels are very, very high because people don't have those different constituents in their food. So we have actually been working on horticulture units with the help of rainwater to be used as drip irrigation. Store the water, then put them in the pipes, and then take them to the plants. And by doing that, we are enabling the communities to have vegetables and fruits within their households, which are otherwise impossible to see or buy within their lives. People sometimes, spend their whole lives without vegetables and fruits. So that's one new area of our work in which we are trying to supplement nutrition by having this technology.
I wanted to take a few quick questions if somebody has some questions, some thoughts about water. Hi, nice to see you.
One of the questions, water as a resource, all the resources, usually we don't have an index or some kind of an indication of what is the true cost or what would be the cost if we didn't have that available. Is it fair to have some kind of an education system where truly at university level, at school level, people are taught that your 1 gallon of water costs you $300, not just 25 cents that it comes to, or lack of it will do something like that. Is that kind of an index or monetary value going to help people to be more aware of it?
Yeah,
I-
Moira?
Could it help the bankers?
Well, I don't know the bankers, but the utilities. But I think there's been definitely efforts in the Chicago region to try to come up with a valuation of water for the region. And, we're still far from actually implementing it, but there's been a lot of work from the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning and some of the universities in the area to come up with a scheme like that. But I mean, the idea is that, yes, it should. And the fact that we're not charging its true value, it's very detrimental, because then we don't use it as rationally in terms of economics. Now, that said, coming up with a true value is, a very elusive concept, because that will probably change depending on who you ask, what region you're in, the conditions. There might be change over time, and so there needs to be a way to adapt that, as well over time. But I say, even if we don't get to the true value, hey, any value is better than none. So I think that it's definitely the step, one of the steps in the right direction. But I think that also people, some of the pushback that you get is like, well, people won't want to pay it. Well, that's the point, right?
But how do you feel about commodifying water? Because it's bad news. I think the idea of commodifying this thing that we all need to live is, not good. I didn't like it that, like at the end of The Big Short. Did anybody see The Big Short? And at the end, the guy who knew all the mortgages said he went into water. The next thing he went into that he wanted to figure out what was going on is water. This dude, this hedge fund dude, and they're you know, I don't want those dudes telling me
Yeah.
where like,
Yeah.
who can.
I had a friend of mine 20 years ago was telling me, I thought he was crazy. He said, Fred, one day water is going to be the most precious, the most profitable. People who has the water are going to be the most wealthiest people. And I mean, it's here and now. Water is a commodity. And that's why, you know, the bankers, the whole financial, when you talk about value, water should be a commons. It should be a right. You can't, how do you measure that in terms of economics? We could measure it in terms of energy input, but when it's measured in terms of economics, that means somebody's not going to get it. I bought a bottle of water earlier. It was $3. Oil is cheaper. Now it's a commodity. I mean, we might not think it's a commodity. It's a commodity. It's water industry. It is an industry now. And I think, and I feel strongly that because of this perception of extraction and economic extraction is the cornerstone of why we don't have adequate water. I can look at the agricultural practices out where we are, and you can, as you come into Pembroke, the agricultural land they use a lot of chemicals. That has an impact on what happens to water when it hits the soil. And that runoffs from that water. So agricultural practices, we don't do enough biological agriculture. I think that's one of the key problems. Most of our agriculture is chemical based. So it takes a lot of chemicals, it burns up the microorganism in the soil, it can't hold water. So if we can begin at whatever level we can to move away from that mind that looks at the world as something to extract, I think we can have some long-term paradigm shifting, but we can keep repeating all the complications about water systems and design, but we forgot the designer.
May I
Sure,
just add something
Moira.
to that? So just to clarify, as I was saying there, I don't think that economics is the only way. I think it's one of the ways, especially when you have large metropolitan areas with so many people that you're just trying to organize the way that people use the water, and it's not, in smaller communities, definitely there are other avenues where you can organize around the commons, as you're saying,
Right.
with different kinds of institutional arrangements. But when it becomes a large, very large system, those things can happen at the local level, but then they're very difficult to build up to the, bigger regional level.
Right.
And sometimes pricing can help, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't think of rights, redistribution, and things like that, and fairness.
Let's go tear up the golf courses.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right now in Flint, they are giving a case per family. And if you had money, you wouldn't be in a conversation of a case per family. Economics it would be great to separate it from people's needs, but I don't know how we can do that now.
One more, sir.
Yes, thank you. Fred, you mentioned the extractive mentality, which is dominant in our culture. Do you have a term for the alternate view?
Well, the alternate view is one that we all got historical links to. We do not look at the environment as if it's separate. If I look at you as something other than me, I can only look at you as something I can get out of you. So indigenously, we looked at the environment as if we were part of it. Right now, we've been conditioned and trained and educated, and it's a good business practice to look at things like that. It makes everything profitable. Maximum profitability, minimum input. I was trained well. So, I mean, we look at each other like that. It just don't sit in your business or at the plant. It lives in our relationship. So to me, the way to be with this is acknowledge that we are a part of it. And when I'm a part of something, my design would be different, all right? So if I see that I'm tied to you intimately, if I harm you, it's like harming myself. So it's this whole thing of separateness, and that's what the extractive model, I think it's dangerous right now because we got it everywhere in education. We got just-in-time educational systems now. We use it for management of all the resources. I went to a meeting once in Iowa at the Leopold Institute. It's supposed to be the top sustainability institute. But I came from a background of high level of extraction. When I started looking at the language that we was using to resolve the problem, it was the same language that created the problem. Just in time, looking at people as a value chain, all those kind of terms started in the industry that really decimated the planet. So we have to learn how not to look at things going forward with that, because we're going to repeat the same thing. It's the same headset. So to me, looking at the environment and all the things around you as if it was part of you would determine how you design. It would determine your actions. You know, I would behave differently. That's not hard to do, but we've been told it's hard to do because it's a lot of profit in not doing that.
Well, that's a great place to end, I think. Yay, thank you, panelists.